Welcome to another Atypical Philosopher video. I'm going to do a bit of a counter-apologetics video whereby I am going to deal with some really quite common apologetics techniques and claims that are made in the context of the Nativity accounts of Jesus in Matthew and Luke, and the problems that they present when you try and harmonize the two accounts together. Now, I've talked about this in previous videos to some extent, particularly in terms of the census. The census is a massive problem. I had a debate about a year ago on Unbelievable with Justin Briley, and had a debate with Lydia McGrew, a Christian apologist, and we cross swords over, the Nativity and a lot of the claims. Christians that watched that video, not all of them, but a lot of them in the comments were like, "Oh, she won that easily." And I wrote a few articles on this, say I don't know what they were watching, but I do understand why they thought that, because they don't think critically enough. What I mean by this is that what Lydia McGrew did throughout the entire debate was the possibiliter ergo probabiliter fallacy. What that means is she presented arguments that were possible, and therefore for her they became probable. In other words, just because she presented an answer, Christians watching thought, that's an answer, therefore it must be the answer, therefore his point's been disproven. And it's utterly ridiculous, because what she was presenting were incredibly implausible, only conceptual possibilities, but that had no historical credibility or sort of inductive plausibility. She was just saying, well, this might be a way of getting around this problem that you present, Pierce, and therefore that's my answer, and that's answered your problem, without really dealing with whether what she said was in any way plausible or highly probable, which it should be in order to be the most rational explanation for the data. Now, I'm going to present to you a video of hers in which she sort of disagrees with a bunch of my points, and she has 4 points. But before I start on that, it's just really interesting that she even calls the video, that pesky census. And then talks about how the census is, in fact, I'll play you a little bit.
So it's inevitable that I'm going to have a video on the census, because this census that Luke describes in Luke 2:1 and 2 has been the source and the center of a great deal of scholarly discussion and controversy, so much that I'm not even going to try to describe all of it for you. I'm going to link an accompanying blog post in the video description below, which will get into some additional issues that I can't fit into this video.
Now, the reason why I played that part is because she is admitting, and rightly so, that the census is a really prickly area, and it has involved a huge amount of ink to be spilt over it, for a long time, and from an awful lot of apologists and exegetes and skeptics alike. So here she is, really rightfully admitting this is a very difficult thing to deal with, to harmonize with, for example, Matthew, but also to establish on its own merits as far as a Lucan claim is concerned. I say this because I have had her video posted to me by other sort of trollish Christians going, "There she goes, bosh, this disproves all your points." And it's like, hang on, if it was that easy, and rather similar in her video herself, if her answers are that easy and that obvious, why has so much ink been spilt? Why is this such a difficult, pesky census, in her own words? So her defences, by point of fact that of her own omissions, can't be that obviously plausible. Because if they were, that's all you would need. And you wouldn't need millions of words spilt over the census problem. So bear that in mind, because what she is going to be presenting isn't actually, well, it's not even remotely robust. So I think what she presents is incredibly weak, and I will tell you why. But bear in mind that she admits that this is a big problem and then kind of hand waves it away as if it's not a big problem. That should tell you something.
In this video, I'm just going to make 4 main points. The first point I want to make is that Luke himself is a historical source for that time period. And therefore, if he tells us that there was a census in Judea at this time, that is evidence for a census in Judea at this time.
I don't really dispute this at all. In fact, she goes on to talk a little bit about this point, and I think she ends up misunderstanding me in the debate we had, because I don't deny that Luke claiming there was a census is evidence for there being a census in some respect. The point is, she says the words "at this time." That's the key, because she doesn't say what the time is. Luke says there is a census, and the implication from all the other knowledge we have about Quirinius and the census is that it happened in 6 CE, AD 6, right? So that's the time issue that we have, because that does not correlate with Herod being alive, which is Matthew's nativity account has Herod, and we know he died in 4 to 5 BCE. So just be careful with that. I agree with her first point to a degree, but it depends what she means by that time. I'm also going to read to you actually what Luke claims now. I think it's probably a good time to bring into play what he actually claims. And in that context, I'm also going to say I will be spending an awful lot of time referencing the absolutely fantastic Raymond Brown's The Birth of the Messiah. It's a masterpiece of exegesis, and I know I refer to it a lot. There are loads of other sources in here, and there are loads of other sources that I use in my book, The Nativity, A Critical Examination, that talks a lot about this. But Raymond Brown is really just a phenomenal scholar. So I will be referring to that book, and page numbers will be relevant to that book. So this is from Luke chapter 2, verses 1 to 5. At that time, an edict went out from Caesar Augustus, so that gives us a bit of dating going on there, that a census should be taken of the whole world. A problematic claim, because no such census has ever been known for the whole Roman Empire. This was the first census under Quirinius as governor of Syria. The first census of Quirinius, as in if there was more than one, this is Quirinius's first one. Or the first census of Syria, when Quirinius happened to also be governor. And so all went to be inscribed in the census, each to his own city. Joseph also went up from Galilee. It's actually down, but there's a reason why that's written in that way. From the city of Nazareth into Judea to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to have himself inscribed in the census. And that is taken from the Bible quote within Raymond Brown's book. That is a really interesting claim from Luke for a whole bunch of reasons that some of which we'll come on to. I'm also going to read you another quote from Raymond Brown. This is on page 554, kind of the end of the section on his analysis of the census and why it is important is because it kind of sums up the problem that Lydia McGrew has, and actually sums up what she's trying to do. Again, page 554. When all is evaluated, the weight of the evidence is strongly against the possibility of reconciling the information in Luke 1 and 2, what we just read. There is no serious reason to believe that there was a Roman census of Palestine under Quirinius during the reign of Herod the Great. Indeed, as regards the non-biblical evidence, it is doubtful that anyone would have even thought about an earlier census if he were not trying to defend Luke in accuracy. It's exactly what Lydia McGrew is trying to do. The information in Luke 1 may be correct. Jesus may indeed have been born during or at the end of the reign of Herod the Great. But Luke seems to be inaccurate in associating that birth with the one and only census of Judea, not of Galilee, conducted in AD 6 to 7 under Quirinius. So what Brown is saying here is that you could be right to say that there was a sense that Jesus was born in the time of Herod the Great and that he died in 4 to 5 BCE. That can be fine, and Luke could be right in having his story set at that time. But what Luke can't be right in saying is that the census of Judea, which is not of Galilee, which is where they appear to be living in Nazareth, what he can't say is that was conducted at any time other than 6 to 7 CE under Quirinius. And anyone that tries to harmonize this really is doing it because they absolutely need to defend accuracy at the expense of being rational. And I think that's what apologetics is, but that is what this kind of biblical literalism that I think Lydia McGrew and her followers are seeking to maintain, certainly in this analysis. Raymond Brown's great. The reason I like him is because he's pretty darned honest. Like he's meticulous in his research, and he's happy to go, well, actually there is historical inaccuracy here. In fact, when he evaluates the whole of the Nativity narratives, he broadly finds them, and this is a Roman Catholic, as a Catholic exegete of immense respect and credibility, broadly says that they're historically implausible, but they have theological verisimilitude. But there you go. So let's go on to her next points.
I recently debated an atheist, Jonathan Pierce, about the nativity narratives, and naturally we discussed the census. And one of the things that Pierce said was, we wouldn't even suspect that there was a census at this time if it weren't for Luke. Words to that effect. The fact that we don't have something somewhere else recording this is not really an argument against a historian like Luke, for whom we have other evidence of his truthfulness when he tells us that it did happen.
I literally have no idea where she's getting that from. None. I'm not saying Luke is our only source for the census. I've not said that at all. I've never said that. It's not in my book. In fact, I say we know the census is then precisely because we have external sources. We know the census in 6 to 7 CE because of Josephus, because of our Roman records, because of this, because of that. So I literally don't know what she's saying there. That's just not correct. The whole point is that we are using all of these sources to anchor the census at 6 to 7 CE, and therefore we cannot place Luke's Quirinius census, a census that happened, albeit in Judea, we cannot place that census in the reign of Herod the Great. That's the issue. It's not that Luke mentions a census. That's absolutely fine. It's the coherence of the two narratives together. Oh, and one other point. Please do not, Lydia McGrew, please do not call Luke a historian. Luke is not a historian. This is a really clever little sort of thing that apologists do, to just slip in words that prime the listener or the reader to think, oh yeah, so Luke is a historian, therefore what he's doing is writing history. He is not writing history. He is an evangelist, Luke the evangelist. He is writing an evangelical text to evangelize to the reader, to the listener. He's not a historian. He does not use historiographical techniques. Go and read Richard Carrier's Not the Impossible Faith for a whole treatment of whether Luke is a reliable historian. The answer, he's not. Of all the things that said, certainly so far, that is an irritation of mine that gets my goat because it's disingenuous. I think that is disingenuous. McGrew goes on to talk a little bit about how, although the prophecy that Jesus should be born in Bethlehem from Micah is really explicit in Matthew, which it is, it's not explicit in Luke. So it doesn't look like, well, it's not necessarily the case that Luke is trying to fulfill this prophecy and getting Jesus down from Nazareth to Bethlehem. And therefore, you know, if he is trying to do that, he would have just had Luke born already in Bethlehem. But I think Luke is taking on the commonplace knowledge that Jesus is from Nazareth, and therefore the family is from Nazareth, and thus needed to move him down there. And that there are implicit references to the idea of needing to come from Bethlehem. This is why there are shepherds involved. The Tower of the Flock, Migdalida, and all these kind of ideas. I'm not going to go into it because it will take us off left field and it takes too long. If you want to know, go to Birth of the Messiah Raymond Brown, page 420 to 424. But basically, that will talk about it. Yes, no, it's not explicit. Like Luke doesn't say, and here is the quote from the Old Testament or from the Hebrew Bible. But there are so many things that appear to be relevant to that in the way that Luke constructs his narrative.
The second point, which is very easy to see, is that a skeptic, and Pierce is an example here, will sometimes say that Luke and Matthew contradict one another about the question of whether Jesus was born when Herod the Great was alive. Matthew is, of course, very explicit that Herod the Great was alive at this time and even after Jesus' birth for a while. And they'll say that Luke contradicts this because Luke is supposedly putting Jesus' birth at the time of a census in what we would call AD 6, which is quite a bit later and is after the death of Herod the Great. But that's just wrong. Luke 1:5 expressly sets these events in the days of Herod the King. That's right when Luke is launching into the story of the conception of John the Baptist, and Jesus is only 6 months younger than John the Baptist. So Luke is well aware that Jesus was born during the time of Herod. In fact, he affirms it, but in a way that is different from and independent from the manner in which Matthew affirms it. So they actually mutually reinforce one another on that point of Jesus being born during the time of Herod the Great, known as Herod the King.
Okay, so what's going on here is that McGrew is saying that at another point in Luke, we have evidence that Herod the Great is mentioned concerning the birth of Jesus. So with regard to the John the Baptist being announced, and John the Baptist is 6 months older than Jesus, and therefore if John the Baptist was born around the time of Herod the Great, then Jesus is going to be born around the time of Herod the Great. Of course, there are a few, well, there's a lot to say about that. This still doesn't get you Quirinius' census. So if you accept that Luke is talking about Jesus being born at Herod the Great's during Herod the Great's reign, and you accept that other reference to Herod being Herod the Great to do with John the Baptist's annunciation, then Luke is internally contradictory with himself, because he cannot, you cannot have, and McGrew does nothing to solve this adequately, you cannot have the census of Quirinius. It's very explicitly Quirinius, and Herod being alive at the same time. Whether it's between Matthew and Luke or within Luke, Herod, we know, died in 4 to 5 BCE, and then we know that his son Herod Archelaus took over. Well, you had Herod Antipas as well, tetrarchs of different areas, took over, but Herod Archelaus did such a bad job that after 10 years the Romans took over, and it turned from a client kingdom that did not require, in fact no client kingdom has ever had a census ever, so in the history of the Roman Empire, so Herod would never have had a census. There's no precedent for it because he's a king and in charge of his own taxes. Romans only had censuses to find out, well, there are a few different types of census, but this is clearly a tax census, as according to Luke. And you only had a tax census if it was a Roman province, because they were going to tax them directly and needed to know who was about and who could be taxed and how much money they're going to get. Now, when the Romans took back over the Judea from Herod Archelaus, they had a tax census in order to establish what the province was worth, and that happened in 6 CE, 10 years after Herod the Great died, and that's mapped out as far as we know when Quirinius reigned. We know we've even got coinage to suggest different rulers and things going on, and we've got Josephus and we've got Cassius Dio and lots of other sources that establish that dating. Okay, so if Luke's then saying, oh, when Jesus was born at the time of Herod the Great, then Luke is wrong with himself and with Matthew, because that placing of the census cannot be concurrent with Herod the Great in Matthew or Herod the Great in Luke's own writing. But actually, there's a lot to be said about this reference to Herod in Luke's earlier passage, Luke 1:5. Now, I'm going to read from Raymond Brown's Birth of the Messiah, page 547 and then 548. Because I think, he sums it up just really well. So, in 1:5, Luke tells us that the annunciation of the birth of John the Baptist took place, quote, in the days of Herod, king of Judea, close quote. According to our best information, Herod died in March-April 4 BCE. According to Luke 1:36, Mary's pregnancy began some 6 months after Elizabeth's. And so Jesus would have been born about 15 or 16 months after the annunciation of John the Baptist's birth. Now, first thing to mention here is that someone like McGrew is assuming that everything Luke says here is correct, is assuming that John the Baptist was born at that time, was assuming that Jesus was born 6 months after John the Baptist, and was therefore born at that time as well. So, this is all assuming that we're taking Luke for granted here. And so according to Luke 1:36, Mary's pregnancy began some 6 months after Elizabeth, and so Jesus would have been born about 15 or 16 months after the annunciation of John the Baptist's birth. This would fix the year of his birth at no later than 3 BC, and would bring Luke into an approximate correspondence with the information in Matthew 2 that Jesus was born in the last years of Herod's reign. Okay, so what Brown is saying here is that if you believe Luke is being correct in his claims of Jesus's birthday in terms of John the Baptist's annunciation, and that is at the time of Herod the Great, then this does mean that Luke is correlating with Matthew. However, we haven't got the mention of the census yet. However, such a date is 10 years before Quirinius became governor of Syria and conducted the census. So we know that because, and Luke also mentions the census is under Quirinius, right? So we still got this problem. There are three basic approaches in dealing with this conflict. First, one may seek to reinterpret the Herod chronology of Luke 1 to agree with the Quirinius census dating AD 67 of Luke 2. So that means take Herod the Great, move his death 10 years forward, and there are some people that do try and do that. Second, one may seek to reinterpret the Quirinius census chronology of Luke 2 to agree with the Herod dating of 4 to 3 BC of Luke 1. So this is a case of taking the Quirinius census and moving that back into the lifetime of Herod. Third, one may recognise that one or both of the Lucan datings are confused and that there is neither a need nor a possibility of reconciling them. Basically, this appendix will come to the conclusion that the third approach is the most plausible, but only after a thorough discussion of suggestions made in the first and second approaches. What he's saying here is that after he's looked at all the data and all the history, and he's an excellent exegete and historian, he says that the only way of understanding the data here is that Luke is confused and is wrong. McGrew won't have that. She can't have that because it's possibility, 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 possibility. So what someone like McGrew and these other Christian commenters who have been like posting that I don't know what I'm talking about, yada, 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 it's this idea that we have this problem. And we go, problem equals problem. That's what the skeptic says. There's a problem. These two things don't cohere, therefore one or both of them are wrong. The kind of literalist goes, these two things don't cohere, they have to cohere, they have to be correct, they have to be correct. Is there some conceivable way that I can marry these two things together? Is there some way that this could happen? Yes, there is. There's this conceptual way it might be possible. Therefore, that's what's happened. That's what's happened. I've succeeded. That's what happens. Look, there's a conceptual way that these two things can be married together. Oh, it's like saying it's possibilita ergo probabilita, isn't it? It's like saying well, unicorns could exist. Like I can conceive that they exist. They're not like logically impossible. So therefore, unicorns exist. I'm not sure it's a rational conclusion, really. I mean, we don't have any good evidence that it does exist, that they do exist. In fact, we've got very good evidence they're mythological. So just because something is conceptually possible does not mean it's plausible. And to continue with Brown's quote, an excerpt, the first approach may be dealt with briefly, for the chronology of Herod the Great's reign is too fixed to be changed in order to match a date of AD 67. Completely agree. I've looked at all of the sources on this. One ingenious suggestion, however, is that Luke did not mean Herod the Great, but Archelaus, who is occasionally called Herod, because he is Herod Archelaus and Herod Antipas. His sons were called Herod as well, and who ruled as king of Judea from 4 BC to 6 AD. One could theorize that the annunciation of John the Baptist's birth took place toward the end of Archelaus' reign, AD 5-6. So when he says, when the Bible says Herod the Great in Luke 1:5, they actually mean Herod Archelaus, and that Jesus was born after Archelaus had been deposed and the newly installed Quirinius began the census, AD 67. That's actually far more plausible than anything that Lydia McGrew will say. Another suggestion recognises the likelihood mentioned earlier that in joining the births of John the Baptist and Jesus, Luke reflects theology rather than history. Bang. I always talk about how these gospel writers are writing theology, not history. Theology, not history. Lydia McGrew will talk about Luke being a historian. I will talk about Luke being an evangelist, doing theology. He's doing theology. He's not doing history. But the way she talks about him as a historian means that she's not even prepared to sort of contemplate the fact that he might be primarily doing theology, that he's not actually doing history. Of course he's not doing history. Of course he's not doing history. There's no reason to think he is. They reflect theology rather than history. It is then proposed that Herod the Great, dating of 43 BC, is correct for the birth of John the Baptist, while the Quirinius census dating of AD 67 is correct for the birth of Jesus. And something's got to give in that Lucan claim. And just to finish up this excerpt, these and other suggestions which date the birth of Jesus in AD 67 bring Luke into conflict with Matthew. More importantly, they contradict the remaining items of Lucan chronological information mentioned in the first paragraph, namely 3, 1 and 23. The combination of those two verses pertaining to the beginning of Jesus' ministry indicates that Jesus was about 30 years old in the 15th year of Tiberius, AD 27 to 28. This would agree with the birth in 4 to 3 BC at the time of Herod the Great, but hardly with the birth in AD 67. This difficulty has caused most scholars who wish to preserve Lucan accuracy to prefer the second approach and to seek to redate the census that Luke mentions to an earlier period, harmonious with the reign of Herod the Great. Much of the rest of this appendix will be devoted to the difficulties encountered in the second approach. So now let's see what McGrew's approach to harmonizing the census is.
So that's just completely wrong. There's no contradiction between Luke and Matthew. The third point is that skeptics will say that this is just completely improbable that there would be a census in Judea at that time on independent historical grounds, and so we should just reject it out of hand. Now, I'm going to talk about this somewhat more in the associated blog post that I'll link in the video description, because one thing that will be said is that you would never get a Roman-ordered count of the people or taxation of the people in a client kingdom, which is what this was under Herod the Great. Skeptics are given to making these exaggerated statements. This just a priori would never happen, as if they know how things were done at that time, contrary to a source much closer to the actual time. And that's a very exaggerated statement. There's evidence against it.
Let's have a look very quickly at what she claims here. So, on her blog post, she says, concerning number 3, one claim that you will hear is that Rome would never order a census, either for purposes of counting or for purposes of taxation under a client king such as Herod the Great. This is a really strong claim, and there is little to back it up. It's mostly just an assertion based on the fact that client kingdoms did have some measure of independence, but it's not as though we have a contemporary statement anywhere that the Romans would ever meddle in taxation in a client kingdom or would never order a tally of the people in a client kingdom. On the contrary, here is some evidence that Rome would sometimes do so. In the 30s AD, as Tacitus tells us, Annals Book 6, 41.1, a rather warlike tribe, the Ceetae, residing in the Roman client kingdom of Cilicia, was, quote, pressed to conform with the Roman usage to making a return of their property and submitting to a tribute. They were originally from the mountainous region of Cappadocia, and they retreated there and fought. The client king, named Archelaus, required the help of the Roman legions to defeat them. So it's interesting here. There's a couple of things going on. This does need a little bit of unpicking because Cilicia was a really complex area. And she does go on to discuss this a little bit, and she has a pop at me for a blog post I wrote in response to her. But I will deal with this claim in itself in just a second. One thing she does say is, here is some evidence. Where it's a piece of evidence, arguably, a single example of how this might have happened. There is no other evidence at all of client kingdom Roman taxation. But now we need to have a look at this to see if this is Roman taxation and actually what was going on with that client kingdom. So it is really nuanced. So the first thing to do is just have a look at the actual quote that we get from Tacitus in his Annals, as mentioned by Lydia McGrew in her piece. and the quote is as follows. About this date, the Cetai, and I apologise if I mispronounce that, a tribe subject to Archelaus of Cappadocia, pressed to conform with Roman usage by making a return of their property and submitting to a tribute, migrated to the heights of the Tauric range and, favoured by the nature of the country, held their own against the unwarlike forces of the king, until the legate Marcus Trebellius, dispatched by Vitellius from his province of Syria with 4,000 legionaries and a picked force of auxiliaries, drew his lines around the two hills which the barbarians had occupied. The smaller is known as Cadra, the other as Devara, and reduced them to surrender, those who ventured to make a sally by the sword, the others by thirst. So there you go. So it looks pretty much like that is a client kingdom opting for some kind of census for tax reasons. And the key there is to conform with Roman usage by making a return of their property and submitting to a tribute. Let's have a little think about that. So what's important to note here is that what Tacitus is referring to is not a Roman census. I mean, this is kind of the point, really, that it's a client kingdom and we've got the client ruler decreeing there should be some kind of census for taxation. There should be some... This is not... So in the Gospel of Luke, we have Quirinius, who is a Roman governor, decreeing a census. In this Tacitus account, we have Archelaus the younger decreeing that to conform to Rome, because it talks about a tribute. What would happen is client kingdoms, and this would be the same for Herod the Great, would still have to pay a tribute. They are although they're not a full-blown Roman province, they are a buffer zone client kingdom where they'd have to pay a tribute to Rome, and how they get the money to make a tribute is up to them, right? So Herod would be collecting taxes in some form. He just doesn't have a Roman census to come in and find out where people live and how much money they have in order for the Roman administrative structures to extract that tax directly themselves as they would in a province. So that's really important. And in fact, let me refer you again back to Raymond Brown in Birth of the Messiah, page 552. And he says, fourth, an instance of Roman taxation of a client kingdom has been pointed to in the narrative of Tacitus, Annals 6:41, where around 36 AD, Prince Archelaus the Younger conducted a census according to the Roman custom among the Cetai, who were his subjects in the Cilician section of Cappadocia. But the passage does not say that the Romans imposed this census on Archelaus or his subjects. Moreover, the imposition of the taxes was bitterly resented by the Cetai and led to a revolt. The imposition of a Roman census and Roman tax in the realm of Herod the Great should have produced exactly the same result. So the silence of Josephus, not only about such a census and a tax under Herod, but also about a revolt or protest against Rome over such a practice, is an eloquent argument that there was no Roman census of Palestine before the census under Quirinius and in 6-7 AD, an event with its concomitant revolt carefully described by Josephus. So what this says is that when the Quirinius census of 6 or 7 CE did actually happen, there was a revolt. But we know of no revolt under Herod because there wasn't a census under Herod. Certainly would never have been a Roman census. So when we go back to Cilicia, there was no... What Tacitus tells us is not that there was a Roman census, but in order to pay a tribute to Rome, Archelaus decided to try and raise some taxes, and he was met with a revolt by some of his subjects. But it gets so what this says is that when when the Quirinius census of 6 or 7 CE did actually happen, there was a revolt. But we know of no revolt under Herod because there wasn't a census under Herod. Certainly would never have been a Roman census. So when we go back to Cilicia, there was no. What Tacitus tells us is not that there was a Roman census, but in order to pay a tribute to Rome, Archelaus decided to try and raise some taxes, and he was met with a revolt by some of his subjects. But it gets so what Lydia McGrew's position is, or what her apologetic here is, doesn't wash. It doesn't work, right? And we've known this, like Raymond Brown wrote this some time ago, right? This is not a new finding or something. This has already been rebuked and refuted. Yeah, that's really, really important. But it actually gets a little bit worse as well for McGrew and her position here, as I will read from another source. So this next source is from a paper by Emanuela Borgia, Cilicia and the Roman Empire, Reflections on Provincia Cilicia and its Romanization. So this is basically a history of Cilicia, as far as, moving from a client kingdom, sort of Roman buffer zone, into a full-blown province, but also what happened in that intermediary period. And the point here is that even when it was a client kingdom, it was arguably still provincial and under the sort of direct rulership to some degree of Syria, as we will see in just a second. So Borgia concludes on page 305 of the paper to conclude this tentative outline of the formation process of Cilicia. It is important to underline that this Roman province, unlike many others, had a very complex birth, somewhat difficult to reconstruct. In this period, however, various archaeological data corroborates progressive Romanization of the region, a fairly conservative one on its own, in the areas already subject to Roman rule. So there were some areas that were under Roman rule more directly, such as Plain Cilicia, and in those territories which formerly remained independent. So back on page 304, talks a little bit about the fact that some of Cilicia was still broadly under Roman rulership. So in any case, under Augustus, the reign of the Tarcondemotides was reinstated, and thus a consistent part of Plain Cilicia was independent until 17 AD. As far as can be gathered, the power of the local dynasty was partially overlapping with the effective Roman province. So it's effectively a Roman province. But the administrative situation of Plain Cilicia is still unclear during the 1st century AD, when probably it was not an independent province, but again, or had always been, a part of the Roman province of Syria, as attested in sources mentioning the governor of Syria as responsible for Cilicia as well. That last point is really important, and there's a footnote there. The footnote 39 details all the sources that seem to point to the fact that the governor of Syria was still responsible for Cilicia anyway. In other words, this was a sort of client kingdom that wasn't the kind of client kingdom that other client kingdoms were, and there's a real sort of murky area, and trying to reconstruct exactly what was going on was pretty difficult, because parts of it of the area were carved up and given sort of more independence than other parts. But at any rate, the revolt-inducing attempt at taxation and a census to find out that taxation was not a Roman one anyway. But having said that, there was certainly there was a sort of higher Romanization of this area than other client kingdoms. Point being, broadly, that McGrew's use of Tacitus here and his case of Cilicia in his annals is a false analogy. So it doesn't apply to the sort of census and for taxation purposes that Quirinius was demanding, due to the fact that Quirinius was asking that because it had become a full province after the deposing of Herod Archelaus. And such a census as that wouldn't happen in a client kingdom. That still remains a robust point, and there is no evidence of a client kingdom having a Roman census and Roman taxation. Due to time constraints and having to unpick the rest of that video from Lydia McGrew, and that being about only halfway through at the moment, I'm going to leave it here for now and then do a separate video to pick up where I've left off. Now, I think what this shows you is that it's very easy to make, blithe assertions that I think Lydia McGrew does, and it takes a lot more time to unpick them. And she could say the same about what I've said, of course, and that's indeed what she says, that I'm making these exaggerated claims. But actually, I'm not. These claims are really actually standard claims. I mean, you find them in Raymond Brown, you find them in huge amounts of skeptical sources, as well as, famous biblical exegetes like Brown. This is well-trodden path. I'm not saying anything particularly new or original, but I think what McGrew does is kind of hand wave these things away and say, well, this is what could have happened. And here's an example of how it might have happened because this is a precedent. Well, it's not a precedent. And in order for that to have been a could have happened, you need to present actual positive evidence rather than just having this sort of get out of jail free card that this is how it might have taken place. Rather, common for apologists to do. So anyway, thanks for watching this analysis so far. Hopefully there's something of interest in here for you. It's not too dry. And I will continue this analysis in a next video. Please like, subscribe, share, press the notification bell and stuff. And thank you for listening.